bass movements. What's up, dogs? It's Cameron with Venus Theory, and today we're here to talk about making, morphing, twisting, weird basses and how to achieve movement with your basses. This is a very common question, and it comes from a number of factors, really, so it's not really possible to address every single one of them in a video, but I will show you guys a couple of concepts and tricks and processing techniques I use to make my basses kind of morph and twist and get weird. So let's dive into Cubase and get started. Okay, so today we're here to talk about how do I make basses move. This is like the single most common question I get here. So there are just infinite ways to do this, so I can't really cover every single way of going about this, but I will cover a few of my favorite ways to kind of get modulated, moving, morphing, twisting basses and stuff like that. So we're going to use retrologue today because that's always been kind of my go-to for everything, and it's pretty straightforward, and everything you can do in retrologue you can do in Serum or any other synth, really, because this is about as basic as it gets. So first things first, we're going to do mono, and we're going to drop this guy an octave, so now we've got a bass. So that sounds like crap, but one of the most common ways to get movement is by detuning. So if we have a crazy number of voices, like 8, and then we start to detune this, you'll hear because of the phase of everybody, it kind of just starts to move on its own, especially if you flip this to random phase. So that's a great way to kind of go about that. So usually I do about 3 or 4 voices because I don't want things to be too witch housey and just hive of bees sounding. So 3 or 4 voices usually gives you kind of a nice, wiggly movement. So the next thing about making basses move and slip around is using glide or portamento. So usually a value of about 300-ish, 150 to 300, depends on the track and tempo. This will really help to make that bass kind of slide around. We're going to switch the trigger mode to legato so it won't re-trigger the bass. So you'll hear that gives it a much more smooth movement between the notes. So we could add some distortion as well. Another thing you can do is use different waveforms, like a pulse mod square here. We could leave this an octave above the bass and kind of blend this in. And if we detune this guy as well, we'll just give this like 3 voices, detune it a little bit. One thing we could do is tie this to an LFO. And like LFOs are just such an incredibly common thing that people sometimes seem to overlook. So, using LFOs is a great way, especially at very low frequencies, to kind of make things move around without you having to sit there and automate a million things. So if I play this now, we get these pulse mod squares kind of slipping around. We can make it into more of a solid square wave for a different effect. And, we could drop this down an octave to make it the same pitch as the bass. So that's a great way to do this, and you can tie your LFO to anything, obviously. I really don't recommend tying it to the cutoff, though. I see a lot of people do that in like Serum and stuff, and I always prefer to hand automate this by tying this with MIDI to my controller or by opening up an automation lane and drawing it in by hand. So that's just my advice. One other way to make basses kind of move and feel a bit more organic, which is a thing I'm very big on, is upping the attack and release. Because I don't want this bass to come in like blah, like really hard, all the time. I want it to kind of slip in and out. So that will add a more natural feel to everything. So you'll hear right now that, this just kind of sounds like a Reese. It's not really doing much that's interesting. So filters are where things get fun. So a really common one for me to use is a bandpass filter, and I'm going to go ahead and tie this to my controller real quick. That way I can demonstrate this a bit easier. So as I move this filter around, that makes the bass move. And, that's something to really not overlook, is use your filters, because that's like 99% of my basses is just a lot of filter stuff. Another very common one that people seem to forget about, or just, you know, once they learn it, they keep sticking to it, which is, you know, why these are so great, is a band reject or a notch filter. And this is a really good way to get like neuro bassy type of movements. So one of the big things I think people tend to think is that, you know, everything comes from the synth, and like, I don't know, because like when people ask me about this, like they ask me for the synth patch, and you know, the thing is like, this is the synth patch, is it's just a Reese and maybe a bandpass filter or a notch filter in it, and that's all there is to it. Like, so much of the movement comes from post-processing, which I'm going to show you guys a few ways to go about that now. So one of the big ones is modulation. So chorus and flanger and phaser. We're going to use a chorus on this one because I usually just use chorus for this. Chorus provides a, you know, nice wide detuning effect. And if I disable that, we're back to just regular old nothingness. But if we open up the width, maybe the spatial, you know, stuff like that, and then combined with the big filter movements, you know, we kind of get this moving, ripping bass. Another big one is, I guess we'll do flanger and phaser. So I usually use phasers, and I'll kind of mix these in fairly low because phasers are a very obvious effect, and, you know, it's not something that you want to stand out like, oh, they used a phaser on that. So usually about 10 or 20%. And this, again, just provides these kind of peaks and valleys for things to slip and slide. So you'll hear that that's pretty obvious, so I'd probably take the feedback down, the spatial, maybe change the width a bit. And as we move that filter around, you know, especially, that kind of hides the fact that there's a phaser doing a lot of that weird, slippy, slidey stuff. So another big one is filtering after the fact. So I'm going to grab the kilohertz filter here and, you know, just grab a notch. And as I move this around and move the bandpass around, this will give me a lot of different kind of movements and stuff. So I'm just going to go ahead and open an automation lane here. And what we're going to do is just kind of randomly slip and slide, and there's something, and here you go. So as we loop this and I play and move my bandpass, this filter's also doing stuff, and that's going to give me a lot of crazy different movements. So that's a really big one. Another good thing to do is stuff with like distortion. So one thing we might try is a distortion after the phaser here, and we can just use basic saturation, mix this in about 50-50. And as the phaser hits this distortion, it creates these really neat, kind of crazy, I don't know, artifacts or movements, you know, stuff like that. So this combined with the bandpass and this notch will really start to sound weird. So that's a big one. Finally, you know, the other kind of big things is just automating everything that you can. So, you know, I might automate the detune or control the detune with MIDI CC, and, you know, as I move this filter up, it becomes more detuned, you know, things like that, like taking the time to just automate a ton of parameters. Obviously, you know, you got to be careful and you don't want to overdo it, but that is something that's really important. And then, you know, just don't stop with it. So, you know, with this filter again here, I could add a second filter, and we could just record, or not record, but just write some different automation with it. Doesn't really matter what, but, you know, we could do something like this. So now we have two notch filters combined with a bandpass filter, combined with phaser and chorus and distortion and all this other stuff. And then maybe we could just toss all of this into just kind of a sort of small reverb for kind of that dimension expander effect. So as we do this now, it's going to sound just super crazy and have all this movement and, you know, good stuff to it, that it doesn't sound like just another Reese patch. So again, obviously there are just so many ways to make movement in a bass. You could automate EQs, you could automate the reverb here. We could bounce this out to audio and reverse different sections, or bounce it out to audio, move it into contact, and, you know, resample it there and resample 7 or 8 times, and we get this crazy thing, and, you know, doing multiple passes of automation that's different every time, and, you know, all this kind of stuff. Like, there are just so many ways to go about this. So, you know, take the time with your synth, automate a bunch of parameters or tie them to MIDI, and, you know, take the time to do some post-processing that would create movement. And, you know, these are pretty much anything under the modulation folder will do this. I guess one final one before I call this video done is ring modulation, and we will use this one here. This one doesn't go to 0, so that's sad, but in Ableton, this is a really common one I see people use. So by changing the frequency, we create these kind of ripping, tearing movements. Maybe lower my filter so we can hear that. So if you're a Cubase user like me and you don't have... Cubase has a ring mod, but it doesn't really do what I want it to. So one thing to use is this guy called Chopper here, and we could just set the speed to not follow tempo, and we could just move this around. So you can imagine, as you automate this and automate the filter movements and automate the bass filter with the bandpass, and, you know, maybe automate the phaser rate or width or the feedback of the phaser, you know, you can create these just absolutely insane basses. And that's it for this video, guys. So thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something. As always, be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys again soon.